In January 1993, an article titled Death of an Innocent by Jon Krakauer appeared in Outside magazine. It described the puzzling circumstances surrounding the life and death of 24-year-old Chris McCandless, who'd perished alone in the Alaskan wilderness a few months prior. Krakauer later expanded the piece into the best-selling book Into the Wild, further tracking Chris's 2-year travels via his various writings and interviews with friends and family, and detailing his frame of mind while crisscrossing the U.S. before his journey ultimately ended in an abandoned bus on the Stampede Trail. But there's a good chance you already know about all this. The story is depicted in a popular 2007 film and has fueled fascination and polarizing public discourse for 30 years. Some find Chris inspiring and brave, to the point people have died trying to reach that bus to honor him in some way, leading authorities to relocate it for public safety concerns. Others aren't as sympathetic, describing him as a privileged fool chasing a thrill, who was too arrogant or stupid, or both, to adequately prepare for Alaska's harsh conditions. Updated details about how he died muddy these arguments slightly, since the info that could have prevented his fatal mistake wasn't available at the time. But this video isn't really about combing over those details or sensationalizing the story. In fact, I think the central message of the book and movie is often misinterpreted. I'm more interested in what exactly he hoped to accomplish, why this is where he chose to carry it out, and how the book and movie gently imply his approach was flawed. Chris's reasoning for disappearing into what's often described as America's last frontier was rooted in an aversion to society and its ills. He was fed up with the suffocating hustle and bustle, the superficiality, monotony, and bureaucracy.
There's a wait list to paddle down a river?
He cut contact with his well-off family, gave away his $24K college fund, and early on burned the last of his cash to start from scratch. Through running away like this, he sought to shed society's material excesses along with its expectations and obligations, what many would now call escaping the matrix. As Krakauer describes, Chris possessed a streak of stubborn idealism that did not mesh readily with modern existence. A good reference point for his worldview were the books he carried and annotated. He didn't hold on to many belongings, but treasured his books. It's no surprise his collection included Walden, where Henry David Thoreau reflected on simple living in a cabin in the woods, and wrote the quoted-to-death line, "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation." Or the less quoted but inverse line, "I know of no more encouraging fact than the unquestionable ability of man to elevate his life by a conscious endeavor." Chris also read Thoreau's essay on the duty of civil disobedience, which from the title is pretty self-explanatory. Thoreau's text embodied the core beliefs of that era's transcendentalist thinkers, which also very much involved appreciating the natural physical world. Chris had this visceral sense that he needed to escape from modernity in order to live freely and unencumbered. And when I say modernity, I mean nearly all modern comforts. When he hitchhiked for the last time, he gave his watch away to the driver, saying, "I don't want to know what time it is. I don't want to know what day it is or where I am. None of that matters." His words suggest that not only was he cutting off man-made constructs, but the very idea of belonging to mankind. A pretty extreme version of the "I don't need anybody, I can be by myself" route. Not to insist this was Chris's experience, but I've long struggled with mental health, and part of the problem was leaning into that sense of isolation, being emotionally guarded and assuming I could handle everything on my own. That mindset definitely comes with its drawbacks, and noting today's sponsor, I've been trying to peel it away over the years. When I first tried therapy, it was on an online platform, and my therapist really helped me reshape my day-to-day thought processes and how I approached conflict, and it was just nice having someone to open up to. I really believe services like BetterHelp make talk therapy more accessible, which is why they're sponsoring today's video. BetterHelp connects you with a licensed therapist who's trained to listen and give you helpful, unbiased advice. It's really easy to start with the link in the description. Just answer a few questions and you'll be matched with a professional with years of experience, usually within 48 hours. And switching therapists is also a quick and easy process, so you can be sure to find one you really click with. You can chat via messaging, a phone or video call, whatever you're comfortable with, all from the comfort of your home. If you'd like to try it, head to betterhelp.com/qualityculture or choose Quality Culture during sign up to get a special discount on your first month. People often write Chris off as deluded and selfish, but the truth of his past brings nuance to the surface. Though his sister requested that certain details be omitted from the original book, she's since revealed everything in a 2014 memoir. We already knew she and Chris were illegitimate children, originally their father's secret second family. But in her book, we finally learn the extent of her father's physical and emotional abuse, which was only alluded to in the film, and of their mother's often cruel complacency. Readers with perilous family lives of their own say it's like the book was describing their narcissist parents to a T. I think this puts Chris's disrespect of authority in a new light.
I don't want anything. Okay. Just these things.
He wanted to reject everything his parents valued, all the masks they used to hide their wretched character. He wanted something real. In Walden, Chris highlighted, rather than love, than money, than fame, give me truth. And he wrote truth in big block letters at the top of the page. He also highlighted, the greatest gains and values are farthest from being appreciated. We easily come to doubt if they exist. We soon forget them. They are the highest reality.
Just be out there in it, big mountains, rivers, sky.
Though Thoreau wasn't the only one he got inspiration from. In Boris Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago, he highlighted, there was no one around, neither family nor people whose judgment you respected. At such a time you felt the need of committing yourself to something absolute, life or truth or beauty, of being ruled by it in place of the man-made rules that had been discarded. You needed to surrender to some such ultimate purpose more fully, more unreservedly than you had ever done in the old, familiar, peaceful days, in the old life that was now abolished and gone for good. Chris had scrawled need for a purpose in the margin. But Jack London was his favorite.
Jack London is king.
He'd carved Jack London is king into a piece of wood near his campsite. London's most known for his work set in Alaska, White Fang and The Call of the Wild. They no doubt directly influenced Chris's dreams of roughing it out there.
I'm going to Alaska.
Alaska?
Alaska.
Krakauer notes that London's passions closely mirrored Chris's, condemning capitalist society and romanticizing the primordial world.
I think careers are a 20th century invention, and I don't want one.
These passions aren't unique. They're what partially drive the van life craze and off-the-grid fantasies, what Chris might describe as freedom and simple beauty. The word adventure, after all, inherently suggests a breaking off from comfort zones and trekking into unknown, possibly unconventional territory. In Chris's point of view, Alaska was the ultimate adventure and seemingly the last one he intended to go on. For him, it was the place he could genuinely commune with untouched nature, and perhaps heal the part of himself that required healing. I was first drawn to write about this because I wanted to investigate this concept of time and nature as a balm for mental health. Based on numerous studies, there's clearly some correlation and causation going on there. There's differences between blue versus green landscapes, some evidence suggesting remote locations are more beneficial, but even green spaces in urban areas are linked to positive outcomes and decreases in mental distress. Touching grass isn't just a meme, it's genuinely good for us. There's a few hypotheses as to why. The biophilia theory argues it's because it's how our ancestors lived. The stress reduction one suggests it's because it triggers a physiological response that lowers stress levels. And attention restoration theory says it's because it replenishes cognitive resources and restores the ability to concentrate. The answer is probably a combination, but the last one has always felt the most palpable to me. I think spending time in nature doesn't necessarily give you something, rather it removes it. It detaches you from noise and distraction, gently pulls you from thoughts of the past and future and places you in the here and now.
You're just living, man. You're just there in that moment, in that special place and time.
Ernest Hemingway wrote in Big Two-Hearted River, his muscles ached and the day was hot, but Nick felt happy. He felt he had left everything behind. The need for thinking, the need to write, other needs. It was all back of him. In the translated poem Keeping Quiet, Pablo Neruda wrote, "If we were not so single-minded about keeping our lives moving, and for once could do nothing, perhaps a huge silence might interrupt this sadness of never understanding ourselves and of threatening ourselves with death. Perhaps the earth can teach us as when everything seems dead and later proves to be alive." Existing in these spaces brings out a side of ourselves that's more conscious, deliberate, and mindful. were focused on more tangible, mostly physical concerns, much like all other animals. During his time in Alaska, unlike before, Chris almost exclusively wrote about food in his journals. He documented plans for meals and cooking, the game he'd hunted, the plants he'd foraged. Not much said about the scenery or his reflections on the experience. It could be because food was all that was on his mind. Or it could be, as Krakauer posits, maybe there was no need to dwell on abstractions, at least for now. In this moment, it was time to be profoundly in touch with the physical environment, such that narrowing the experience into limited words was rendered a pointless exercise. That's one theory anyway. In any case, today in this even more draining social climate, it's not hard to sympathize with Chris's philosophy. He felt that within this setting lived the truth he so desperately sought, the realness that had evaded him for roughly 20 years. Nature is straightforward in its beauty and its brutality. It doesn't betray or manipulate. It simply is what it is. The tree requires no explanation or reasoning, no justification for its existence. And so neither do we. Just 3 years later, Cheryl Strayed would have a similar experience. Writing in her 2012 memoir, Wild, "The wilderness had a clarity that included me." She hiked most of the Pacific Crest Trail in 1995, a tumultuous trek to transform her tumultuous life. She'd endured abusive men in her childhood and grew up on the poverty line, much of it in a rural household with no electricity or indoor plumbing. After her mother's death shattered her world, Cheryl stopped college at 22, had multiple affairs leading to a painful divorce, dabbled in heroin use, and was broke and aimless for a few years. This is why in her divorce proceedings she changed her last name to Strayed and had randomly decided to hike the PCT with minimal experience. Obviously, there's vast differences between these two experiences, one of which being the question Cheryl received from nearly everyone she encountered. Aren't you scared? There's an implication that they're not just talking about wild animals. Yet almost everybody she met was kind and helpful, aside from a couple creeps toward the end, one of whom for a minute there seemed like they were going to turn the entire emotional tone of the trip upside down. Thankfully, it didn't escalate further. There aren't as many widely celebrated works about women's solo experiences in nature, their meditations and appreciation, stories about the gritty pilgrimages in which they unravel the ugliness of their lives. Maybe that's why Cheryl's book was so popular in the first place. Though there's this added wrinkle of fear, in her words, she'd come to stare fear down, to stare everything down. This long hike was meant to be her life reset, restorative and redemptive. It was a place where she could perhaps communicate and relate to something sacred and eternal. But she admits she didn't spend much time pondering her life or even the environment around her. The journey's bodily demands removed most of her capacity for contemplation. For most of it, she was consumed only with her most immediate and physical suffering. This detail speaks to an element of all this I'd ruminated on after reading Into the Wild, but I'll get to that in a bit. Chris had actually briefly hiked on the PCT 5 years prior to Cheryl before turning his attention to other exploits. One wonders why he couldn't continue on an extended hike rather than disappear from everyone's lives, including his sister who he was close to and the people he met along the way. He spent weeks or months at a time turning strangers into friends, forming found families in every new location, kind people who'd endured their own hardships and gut-wrenching losses, and often became like new parental figures for him.
I could be your grandfather.
Could we talk about this when I get back from Alaska?
He sent a few of them letters and postcards after his departures, seemingly intending to keep in touch for the foreseeable future. But they were saddened he'd left at all, confused as to what exactly he was searching for, why he was so eager to leave everything and everyone behind. After all, Chris was a sweet, bright kid who got along well with everybody and didn't shy away from social contact. Why had this idea of Alaskan isolation become an inevitability in his mind?
I'm gonna miss you when you go.
I think many people, fans and critics alike, misinterpret the book and even the film as a celebration or glorification of his ideals. But to me, it came across as more of a cautionary tale. Krakauer suggests that with every new migration, Chris had successfully evaded the impending threat of human intimacy, of friendship, and all the messy emotional baggage that comes with it.
I don't understand why every person is so bad to each other. Judgment, control.
It seems his parents had so thoroughly dismantled his trust and faith in people, he decided he should primarily find purpose through other avenues. Yet there's this narrative thread of Chris touching the lives of people who were so unlike his parents. Some even lived the nomadic lifestyle he idolized. The way all their lives continued on was even a focal point of the movie's conclusion. The fact remains he did find joy and meaning in these relationships. People helped and cared and worried for him. Even the last person he ever spoke with spent most of the drive trying to dissuade Chris from his plans by explaining all the reasons he was ill-prepared. But Chris was known for being stubborn. It took convincing to get him to take the waterproof boots. Rather than a standard plan of camping out in nature, Chris's course of action seemed more in line with the survivalist variety, almost entirely rejecting modern comforts. He didn't even bring a map, as though he wanted to pretend he was an explorer in uncharted territory.
I'm gonna be all the way out there, all the way out there, just on my own.
In Leo Tolstoy's Family Happiness, Chris highlighted, "I wanted movement and not a calm course of existence. I wanted excitement and danger and the chance to sacrifice myself for love. I felt in myself a superabundance of energy which found no outlet in our quiet life." But it's clear that nature on its own wasn't enough to satisfy this energy. He'd become obsessed with the idea of proving himself in this arbitrary way. This backwoods experiment was the ultimate test, the hurdle after which he'd be reborn. Inside the bus, he wrote about killing the false being within and spiritual revolution. No longer to be poisoned by civilization, he flees and walks alone upon the land to become lost in the wild. As many can attest to, it's common in our youth to take risks, to discard caution and invite danger in various ways. Chris felt people were conditioned to desire security and conformity, and that this mindset was damaging to the adventurous spirit. What he called unconventional living is what nurtures this spirit. And paired with that theory, he felt a challenge is only real if its success isn't assured, isn't too easy. Thus, its meaningfulness is born from that space of uncertainty. This is further demonstrated in a letter he wrote after he'd worked a job for a few months. He said, "Tramping is too easy with all this money. My days were more exciting when I was penniless and had to forage around for my next meal." To be honest, this statement irked me. I don't think anyone who describes food insecurity as exciting is operating in a reasonable or down-to-earth headspace. I think it reveals how strange and contrived part of his outlook really was. The truth is, as much as Thoreau wrote about the value of solitude, which is fair enough, friends and family were never more than a half-an-hour walk away from his cabin. He spent quality time with them each week. His mom helped cook for him and did his laundry. Social and resource deprivation were never part of the plan. Krakauer notes, Chris was so enthralled by tales like The Call of the Wild, he seemed to forget they were works of fiction, pointing out in a pretty scathing rant that Jack London only spent one winter in Alaska, and his real life did not at all reflect the values in his books. Yet his works are what sparked Chris's infatuation. Even Cheryl had considered leaving for Alaska instead when the PCT hike proved incredibly difficult. Krakauer writes, "Alaska has long been a magnet for dreamers and misfits, people who think the unsullied enormity of the last frontier will patch all the holes in their lives. The bush is an unforgiving place, however, that cares nothing for hope or longing." For this reason, Alaskans view Chris McCandless with a certain vitriol to this day. They deem his overconfidence disrespectful to the reality of the land he so superficially romanticized, and are incensed by the fact others take inspiration from his story. Into the Wild, especially the book, is a cautionary tale because of Krakauer's warning about youths mistaking passion for insight. He spent a couple chapters detailing his own self-imposed dangerous test in Alaska, believing all he'd have to do to change his life was literally climb a mountain. Of course, after doing so, he found that nothing had really changed. He was the same person. Everywhere you go, there you are. While time in nature can certainly help ease our minds and spirits, Chris and Krakauer and Cheryl had projected upon it a predetermined scheme with parameters and constraints. Only through this task could they kill the false being within, and only on the other side of it could they emerge transformed. But assigning our concept of self-worth, our identities, to any external goal, whether physical or capitalistic, doesn't align with nature's state of simply being. That's not to say one shouldn't challenge themselves, but it's a losing game to assume you'll be a totally different person on the other side. Whether it's the other side of climbing a mountain, of making $1 million, or living in the woods for a few months, the internal transformation is a different beast entirely. There's plenty I understand about Chris's philosophy since I'm in a constant internal battle against misanthropy, but I am battling it. There's just as much I disagree with him on. Most of all, the notion that life is most meaningful when it's hard. Though it can help hone our resilience, the level of difficulty on its own isn't what breathes meaning into our experiences. Security and stability aren't only symptoms of fearful conformity. They're a means of peaceful survival, and peace also should be treasured. New doesn't always mean better or more interesting, and often what makes life the most difficult is trying to go it alone.
Where's your family?
Don't have one anymore.
That's a shame.
Based on his writings, at some point Chris concluded his final and greatest adventure and tried making his way back to civilization. But the Summer River had swollen and become uncrossable. Because of this, even though there were likely some underlying mental health issues, I don't buy the theory that this was a suicide mission. Though with no map to advise him, he was unaware of nearby alternate routes. He headed back to the bus to devise a new plan, but his guidebook didn't warn of the paralysis-inducing toxic seeds he was eating, and he passed away soon after. Curiously, in Tolstoy's Family Happiness, he'd highlighted a passage describing how the narrator discovered that what he really wanted was a quiet, secluded life in the country, living for others and doing good deeds, content with mundane pleasures and loving one's neighbor. In the last book he read, Dr. Zhivago, he highlighted, and so it turned out that only a life similar to the life of those around us, merging it without a ripple, is genuine life. And that an unshared happiness is not happiness. Next to it, Chris wrote, "Happiness only real when shared." Joy in solitude is very real and valuable. I mean, in the same book, he marked a sentence about escaping the meaningless dullness of humanity and taking refuge in nature. But I think he was beginning to understand that there could exist a blissful balance. Spending months in total isolation likely shed light on the value of good company. A meaningful life isn't found, but is cultivated day by day, wherever you happen to be. I think he'd have gotten to that place if he had the chance. Really appreciate you taking the time to watch. If you like our videos and want to support the channel a little bit, you can head to our Patreon. We post weekly with updates and other casual videos, but it's just a small way to keep the channel going. Either way, I'm glad you're here. Wishing you all the best. I'll see y'all in the next one.